Unfortunately, if you bought a 3070 Ti, you are probably starting to feel the VRAM pressure. In games, even at 1080p resolution, we can start to see spikes on the frame time graph and textures not loading properly and weird stutters on these 8GB cards. Like I said, even at 1080p resolution now, we'll test out 1440p as well, but here we're looking at the 3070 Ti versus the 5070 Ti. Where in Final Fantasy XVI, I more than double the performance at 1080p. I have an 86% advantage at 1440p Ultra, and in the 1% lows, it's an off-the-charts difference. Look at these spikes in the frame time graph here on the 3070 Ti. Again, these are issues caused by 8GB of VRAM. However, before we move on with the comparisons, why am I focusing on the 5070 Ti? I mean, for one thing, it is the 70 Ti class product, 2 generations later. A lot of people make that upgrade. But another thing to look at is, well, what are your other options if you're kind of in the NVIDIA route? You could go 5060 Ti and go with the 16GB model, but honestly, it's not massively more powerful than the 3070 Ti. Whereas if you go up to the 5070, well, that's 12GB of VRAM, which is okay right now. But, you know, the 3070 Ti was okay with 8GB when it launched, but now a few years later, it's still a fairly powerful card, but choking on VRAM in a lot of games. Not every game, but a lot. And it's causing you some headaches. The 5070 is fine right now. Is 12GB of VRAM going to be kind of causing you some problems? So then you might think about the AMD options with the 9070 and 9070 XT, but they're over $800 for the models that are actually in stock right now, which brings you back to NVIDIA again with the 5070 Ti. This gets you 16GB of VRAM, and it gets you a lot of performance in a lot of games. It's, like I said, similar class of product 2 generations later. So is this an upgrade worth making? That's what we're looking at here. So obviously the 5070 Ti is better, but by how much? Okay, like I said here in Final Fantasy 16 1440p Ultra, not only is it a lot faster, but again, it gives you a smooth experience without those stutters caused by the lack of VRAM. Let's go ahead and look at some other possibilities though, like does kicking on DLSS quality solve the 3070 Ti's problems? No, it gets a 55 FPS average, but now the 1% lows are still spiking and only hitting a 16 FPS, whereas the 5070 Ti has a nice smooth frame time graph, 1% lows at 76, and it's about twice as fast in the averages at 109 versus 55. Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high is another game where the 8GB cards can struggle a bit. We're seeing the 5070 Ti's take a 76% advantage in the averages, but a 94% advantage in the 1% lows. And again, getting you 146 FPS here. Now 1080p, not a super realistic resolution for a 5070 Ti, so let's move up to 1440p. Where at very high settings, we see the 5070 Ti winning by 93%, so just about doubling the performance at 112 versus 58. And let's go ahead and move on to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Well, here I couldn't even run the 3070 Ti at exactly the same settings. I had to go down to the medium texture cache. Otherwise, it looks about the same though, so it's not massively different. But the 5070 Ti takes a 62% lead here at 157 versus 97. Again, this is an example of a game where you really run into issues with the VRAM very, very easily. This is actually, I typed typo here, 1440p Supreme now. We're seeing the 3070 Ti hit 68 FPS, the 5070 Ti hits 127, it's an 87% lead, but again, the 5070 Ti can keep the texture cache at Supreme, whereas the 3070 Ti has to be running it at medium settings. What about Cyberpunk for some path tracing testing? Here, even at 1080p resolution, the 3070 Ti is struggling, hitting 24 FPS, and the awful 1% lows are also an indication that we're going beyond 8GB of VRAM. The 5070 Ti hits 55 FPS, which isn't amazing, but again, this is native resolution path tracing. If you kick on DLSS 4, quality, even at 1080p, looks reasonable, and ray reconstruction, I think, can actually even make the image look a bit better than the native denoisers in this game, and you'd be in a better situation. But let's go ahead and move to 1440p for all of that DLSS testing. So here at RT Overdrive mode DLSS balanced using the transformer model, the 5070 Ti can hit 77 FPS, and this is not using frame generation. And 77 FPS is a very decent baseline from which to use frame generation in a single-player title. So the 5070 Ti is a good card for 1440p path tracing. Again, DLSS balance is looking pretty good now at 1440p when using the new DLSS 4 transformer model. The 3070 Ti, though, is only hitting 32 FPS in the averages and 23 in the 1% lows. So really, the 3070 Ti could not have given you those path tracing experiences. The 5070 Ti has the performance and the VRAM to do so, and frame generation would just be a kind of icing on the cake if you wanted to use it. Silent Hill 2 at 1080p Epic RT on. We're seeing the 3070 Ti not able to hit 60 FPS, it's hitting 50, and the 5070 Ti hitting 89 FPS, so 78% faster than the 3070 Ti. And if we move up to, if we turn off ray tracing, the 3070 Ti is able to hit 59 FPS, so if you want your 60 FPS average there without upscaling, probably turn off the hardware lumen. The 5070 Ti at these settings, though, can hit 113 FPS, giving it a 92% advantage, so basically double. At 1440p Epic settings with the software lumen, hardware RT is off here, the 3070 Ti is only good for 40 FPS, whereas the 5070 Ti more than doubles that at 84. And if you kick on DLSS quality, though, the 3070 Ti can still hit 58 FPS and do okay here, but the 5070 Ti goes to 109 FPS, so nice high refresh rate experience, 88% faster. If we do want to use the hardware ray tracing and use DLSS quality to get decent frame rates, the 3070 Ti is capable of 54 FPS here, but the 5070 Ti is 69% faster at 91 FPS. In another Unreal Engine 5 showcase, Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, high settings are the highest settings in the game. The 5070 Ti is 64% faster at 97 versus 59. But let's move up to 1440p resolution, where the 5070 Ti is 68% faster at 74 versus 44. Now, let's go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, which is able to get the 3070 Ti up to 64 FPS, and the 5070 Ti is good for 106, making it 66% faster. If we take a look at more of a competitive gaming situation, Call of Duty Black Ops 6, 1080p basic settings, I think this is where it's really important to note that the 3070 Ti, if you're mostly playing competitive games at reduced settings, maybe on a high refresh rate 1080p display, the 3070 Ti is still a very capable graphics card. It's hitting 179 FPS here. You're gonna be having a good competitive experience in this game. The 5070 Ti is topping out, really it's starting to hit some CPU limitations at times here. So 300-ish FPS is about the top of the platform I'm on can average here. And that puts the 5070 Ti 63% faster. But as we move up to 1440p resolution, still at basic settings, the 5070 Ti is now 71% faster because there's a little more headroom for scaling. 224 FPS versus 131. But again, notice the 3070 Ti is still getting 131 FPS. So if you're on a 1440p 144 hertz display or 120 hertz display, it's right at home here. So if that's your main gaming use case, you could always ask the question, well, do I really need to upgrade? But again, we could be playing single-player titles here with Ghost of Tsushima, 1080p very high settings, which are the highest settings in the game. We're seeing 151 FPS versus 92, 64% lead for the 5070 Ti, but the 3070 Ti is still giving a good experience here. At 1440p very high, the 3070 Ti is still doing well at 68 FPS, but the 5070 Ti is 65% faster at 112. In God of War Ragnarok, 1080p Ultra, the 3070 Ti is still doing fine, 78 FPS average. The 5070 Ti is 76% faster at 137, so a much nicer experience, but the 3070 Ti is doing fine. 1440p resolution, the 3070 Ti is still good for about 62 FPS, but the 5070 Ti is 81% faster at 112. And that's all the tests that I ran, at least at the same settings on both of these two graphics cards. So why don't we summarize it here with this chart? This is the percentage advantage for the 5070 Ti in each test that I ran. And you can see that it ranges between a little over 60% faster to more than double the performance. The geo mean of all of these tests is 84% faster for the 5070 Ti. So it can double the performance. It doesn't always double the performance, but on average, it's close to doubling the performance. And some of those big leads, though, could have been factoring in the VRAM issues on the 3070 Ti. Anyway, the 5070 Ti, I think, is a very meaningful upgrade from the 3070 Ti, and currently, there's not a lot else that I would recommend in that $800 price class. But it is over $800, so really think about your budget. So I always do mention that if your current GPU is still doing well enough for what you're actually using it for, so the 3070 Ti, for example, yes, it's 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but if you're mostly playing competitive games at reduced settings, like when I was testing out Call of Duty in here somewhere, there it was, the 3070 Ti is still doing absolutely fine, so do keep that in mind. But like I said, the 5070 Ti, if you're looking to do stuff like the latest games, single-player games at high settings that are going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, or trying to use path tracing, things like that, the 5070 Ti is worlds apart in those experiences. Hey, you also get NVIDIA frame gen support thrown into the mix. The 3070 Ti has to fall back on either AMD or, third-party like lossless scaling, things like that. So, yeah, I absolutely think that the 5070 Ti is worth the upgrade from the 3070 Ti, unless you're just kind of playing games that don't really need more power or VRAM or anything like that, in which case, why spend money if you don't need to? That's what I've got for you guys today. Like I said, if I do eventually see the AMD alternatives, actually available at lower pricing, then I think those are good options to consider as well. But currently, at least in the United States, it's over $800 for just the baseline 9070, at least for the models that are in stock. And that's why I'm not really considering them too heavily in this scenario. All right, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.